In this video, we are going to be talking about coral reef communities, and that's absolutely my favorite place on earth to be. And so I'm really excited to dive into this information with you. So, we are going to start by scrolling over some of the key concepts that we are going to be discussing today. But you can come back, even though I'm scrolling through these quickly, and pause it later and see what you need. So, coral reef communities are highly productive parts of the ocean in what would otherwise be like a very nutrient poor and water and lacking oxygen, usually too hot for organisms to live. If you remember, we've talked about before that there are large parts of the ocean, like in the open ocean, that can be very devoid of nutrients and even devoid of a lot of life. And coral reefs live a lot of times in areas like that would otherwise be devoid of other living organisms, but they grow an entire reef foundation that makes in an inhabitable space for many other types of organisms, fish and plankton and algae to come and live because of what they build. So, coral are actually animals and they form a, a relationship. They have a symbiotic relationship with zooxanthellae. And just remember the word symbiotic means that there is a relationship. It doesn't delineate the type of relationship that there is. So, a lot of times, this is this isn't taught all the way correctly in some science courses and even in some books. A symbiotic relationship just means there is a relationship. But then underneath there are three types, and one is mutualistic, where both things benefit. The next one is commensalistic, where one thing benefits and the other organism does is neither help nor harm. It's just kind of neutral. And then the last one is a parasitic relationship where one organism is harmed, but one is helped. So specifically, coral with zooxanthellae have a mutualistic relationship where they are both helped by each other. So when you look at this coral, this really pretty pink coral, if you look at it, if you zoomed out of this, you would just see a really pretty pink coral. But if you zoom in really carefully, you will see these different polyps, and each of these individual polyps kind of steps up next and grows next to other polyps, and all together make a whole colony over the entire coral altogether. And if you look at them closely, you might say, like, oh, that looks like an upside down jellyfish, or that sort of looks like an anemone, because they're all related. They are all different types of cnidarians or animals with stinging cells. And so that's why coral, you can have like fire coral, things like that, where if you get cut up by coral because you fall on it, step on it, whatever, it can sting you, and in fact it will sting its prey as well. So there is coral that will actually build reefs and actually have these really hard parts and these all these little hidey holes and places for things to eat and to lay their babies, and that's called the scleractinian corals. And there's a specific type called the hermatypic species that deposit calcium carbonate, and they make the reefs for other organisms. Then there's the ahermatypic corals that do not build reefs, like this sea pen that you commonly see in Southern California. I see these a lot when I go diving or even snorkeling in areas like La Jolla in Southern California. You'll see these guys. These are not reef builders. But even in Southern California, where you think, well, we don't really have coral that build a reef, here's actually an example, and it is 300 meters deep, so you can't, scuba there, but a place that is in Piggy Bank in Southern California that has this kind of bubblegum type of coral and these white corals here that will build a calcium carbonate type of reef. So usually these corals will actually feed by paralyzing their prey with their tentacles, and then they will sort of absorb the nutrients into their gut. Okay, so Uh, Corals actually originally develop from a little planular larva. Look at that little planula larva that goes and sticks onto a hard surface, and it fuses to the hard surface like, okay, this is going to be my little house. And as it does that, it will actually secrete some calcium carbonate that will fuse to the rock below and make this hard um, fusion to that rock. And then from there, it can kind of grow up. Well, like we showed in that zoomed in picture, it's not just one polyp. Now it's got to build lots of polyps. Like it's got to get some buddies around it to make the coral as a whole. So when it does that, it can do it in a couple of ways. It can do it by classic sperm and egg that make another planular larva, or just like a plant, you can have cuttings like fragments that break off and bud off and make identical clones. And based on the species of coral, it will actually shape into a different shape that we'll talk about, some of the coral shapes in just a minute. But that's basically the life cycle. It can either reproduce by budding or by classic sperm and egg. So, um, this is like a really great story to learn about coral nutrition. So, we said that there is a symbiosis, meaning there's a relationship and it's mutualistic between coral and a plankton called zooxanthellae. And zooxanthellae has the word zoo at the front, meaning it's an animal, but it's interesting because it's an animal that basically can photosynthesize like a plant. Well, coral, over its evolutionary history, has only been able to supply itself with about 10% of its nutritional needs. The rest of its nutrition, about 90%, is coming from zooxanthellae, and this is how that happens. Coral by itself, and you can see this a little bit here in this zoomed in picture, coral by itself is kind of white, translucent, see-through, like this. And you can kind of see through it here and see how it's sort of whitish. And it can only make 10% of its food, so what is it going to do? Well, there's a bunch of zooxanthellae plankton that are floating around in the water, and these guys would be food for whatever filter feeder came by. So these zooxanthellae are like, hey, coral, can we come and move into these clear tubes to hide? And you can see some of them here. And the coral's like, yeah, that's cool. I wasn't doing anything with that space, but then you do need to pay me rent, and you do need to pay me about 90% of my nutritional needs so that I can stay alive. So I'll give you a house and a place to stay, and you're going to extra photosynthesize so you have enough food for yourself, but then you can also feed me. And the zooxanthellae's like, cool, we're down for this deal. And then they go and move inside. When the zooxanthellae go inside of the coral, whatever color that zooxanthellae is, that's what color the coral is. So the coral that was clear before, if it takes on a pink zooxanthellae, it is now pink. If it takes on a purple zooxanthellae, it is now purple. So it's the zooxanthellae that gives the coral its color. So when you see a coral that has this beautiful like color inside, just know that it's the zooxanthellae that's giving it that gorgeous color. So the zooxanthellae specifically provides glucose, glycerol, amino acids, and the coral makes a nice habitat and does provide some nutrients, which is really cool. Okay, so what could go wrong? Well, this is what can go wrong in that relationship. Usually it goes great, okay? But sometimes, and especially we see in climate change with warming, a lot of times climate change, which is the ocean, have gotten just a couple of degrees warmer, like 2 to 4 degrees warmer, or degrees C warmer, which doesn't seem like a big deal. And that tends to not affect like the really big, like marlin or shark, or doesn't seem to hurt the whales as much. What gets hurt is the zooxanthellae. So the zooxanthellae, as the ocean warms, as the sun is coming through, like with decreased ozone layer, and it's brighter and sunnier, these zooxanthellae, which photosynthesize like a plant, they will actually over photosynthesize, and then they will, like an animal, they digest those nutrients too quickly and make a lot of sludge and sewage that lands inside of these tubes. So now this is like a renter living inside of the coral that's being disgusting and leaving its trash everywhere. Like, you appreciate having the food, but they're just a hot mess, making this waste everywhere. And specifically, the coral starts to go to a state that's called septic, where it starts to turn very bright yellow with all of this sewage sludge. So even in humans, if there's a human that, quote, goes septic medically, it's a very, very dangerous situation where the human can die very quickly if they don't have intervention and help. And um, specifically here, the coral makes it a point to kick out its renter. It says, "Get out of here, zooxanthellae. You're out. You're not going to stay here anymore." And it kicks out that zooxanthellae. So now the coral, it might still be bright yellow because it's got that sewage in it, but in a day or two, it'll kind of clear out. Well, what's the problem with that? The problem is now the coral is, quote, bleached. It doesn't have its color anymore, which is what physically makes it look bleached. But additionally, it is not getting 90% of its nutritional needs from the zooxanthellae. So it is only getting 10% of the food that it needs. Well, if you were only getting 10% of the food that you needed, it would be just a short while before your body couldn't take it anymore and you passed away. And so at this point, corals, it depends on the type and how severe the bleaching is, but it can be 2 weeks, maybe a month, maybe, and the coral has totally died. During this phase, because the coral is very stressed, its immune system is down, algae will come and grow all over it. You'll see it getting green, covered with algae, which is overtaking it and killing it, and it just speeds up its death. Now, people always ask, in that case, and it's bleached, and say this yellow sludge has cleared out, is there a chance that it can rebuild? Yes, it's not a very good chance because this is something that's been pushed to the brink. But if conditions in the area quickly change and the coral can take on a new zooxanthellae and have that healthy relationship restored, and it can happen before it's too far gone, then yes, it can actually be restored. It's not often that this is happening, but there have been cases of that happening. So I just put another picture here to kind of, I personally don't think there's any good drawings of this, and I don't think that this is the best drawing, although I appreciate it. It's one of the best ones I could find. So if anybody ever wanted to illustrate that story better, it would be great. But here's the coral, and you see the little zooxanthellae polyps, the polyps that have the zooxanthellae on it. It's very stressed here, and that's why it's turning bright yellow. And in fact, if you look down here at this reef, you can see some of that. And then it expels the zooxanthellae and becomes white. It's now bleached. And unless it gets some quick help, it's going to get covered with algae and become black. And you can see some of this black, dead coral here, which has totally passed away. It's dead. It's covered in algae. You can see some white that is severely bleached and it's not doing well at all. You can see some here that is in the yellow stressed phase. And a lot of the times these look actually bright, bright, bright fluorescent yellow. So when I was an early scuba diver or snorkeler and I didn't realize that, I would take some pictures because I'm like, whoa, this one was like fluorescent yellow. It was so cool. And now I know, no, that's the opposite of cool. It's like really bad and very stressed out. And then there are some healthy coral in this picture that hopefully there's not too many bad conditions here, but it's not looking good. I'm seeing a lot of dead, a lot of white, and a lot of very stressed, and only a couple of healthy ones left. And you can also see in this picture that certain species are doing better than other species. which can be the case. Okay. So, coral nutrition. How does coral get its food? Well, coral can be like predators using those stinging cells that they have because they are cnidarians with the stinging cells to kill small animals and like zooplankton. And here's a really cool video of a coral feeding in close up from Forest and Ocean. And then here's another video from National Geographic's on Coral Reefs 101 where they paralyze their food with the stinging cells and bring it into their digestive cavities. They can also eat different bacteria that make their way into their bodies. So, how do you reproduce coral? Some coral is being reproduced by fragmentation, which we talked about earlier. This is an asexual form of reproduction. And here's a really cool video from BBC Earth Coral Gardening in the South Pacific. So, in the South Pacific, in the island communities, they are regrowing coral. You can see that they have put the fragments on these little rocks. And then here they're growing them on tables. These tables that these scientists are looking at are regrowing the coral. And then once these are big enough or needed in a certain space, they will go and transfer them. So this is not the final home. These would be way too crowded if they were. But they will be taken to a new home with Reef HQ, which is in Townsville, Australia. I got to see how the Australian government is doing using fragments like this to regrow parts of the reef that then they're taking out and replanting the Great Barrier Reef. So, sexual reproduction in corals can happen by corals releasing their eggs. And although this is a clam, it shows you about what corals look like when they squirt their sperm. It's called broadcast spawning, meaning they're just broadcasting their sperm into the water, and then hopefully the sperm will meet up with some eggs and make that planular larva that will find a little home. Some corals are actually brooders, meaning they keep their eggs inside and then hope they get hit with the sperm until it does happen, and then the planular larva is released. Interesting, if you're in the Pacific Ocean, the release of the eggs and the sperm is synchronous, happening at the same time. But who knows what's going on in the Caribbean? But randomly at different times, you might have some of the corals releasing sperm and other different species releasing their eggs. And it's just kind of happening throughout the year, different species, more like taking turns. But it's not all synchronous like it is over in the Pacific. Okay, so I really like this video, which is actually from Travel and Leisure, about how scientists are restoring the Great Barrier Reef. It really shows, like, after a storm, what the reef looked like and then how they are restoring it. I recommend checking that one out. Okay, so a lot of reef destruction happens over time, and this is actually a natural process, and it forms a lot of the sand and substrate for other organisms to come along. So while I love the coral, it actually is good and it's part of its natural process to have it break down over time when it's not too much. So one of the ways that happens is you can have organisms like sponges, worms, or boring organisms basically bore holes. And here's some Christmas tree worms that are boring little holes into the coral so that they can live and have a space to live. They're like, this looks like a nice little rock. Let me make a hole and I will live on top of it. And over time, here I need to show you the picture. Over time, that is going to break off the base of the coral, and it's going, you might have a storm or something or a large wave surge that will break the coral off at the base, and then basically it's going to erode down. I actually have a video that I took here on the big island of Hawaii. And it shows me swimming up from about 122 feet. You can see here some like columnar, like pillar coral, which, let me see, right here is a little bit, but it's the ones that stick up like a pillar. You can also see some large like plate coral, and there's like the columnar pillar coral, plate coral. You can see more of that. It was really dark. Look at that awesome plate coral there. It was really dark, but then right about here, you can start to see a lot of green algae growing over the coral. Green algae is a competitor with the coral and it's trying to overgrow it. And I would say that in the parts where there's green algae, you can see that coral is very stressed because its immune system is not as good. Now we're getting to a point where all of this is just coral rubble and you can see a lot of green algae in the background. And in fact, I'll reach out my hand here and zoom in a moment and kind of pick it up so you can see that this is all fallen coral rubble from storms that had a weakened immune system. See all that green algae on it? All of that is rubble for many, many feet until way up there you can start to see some healthier coral. Okay, so that's about what this process looks like. And I believe that this is coral rubble from a storm, although there's definitely always human factors that make a difference. So as the coral is broken up, like we just saw in that video, you'll have different coralline algae and bryozoans that come and settle on it. It's like, oh, this is a great place to live. And it slowly breaks down this substrate into smaller and smaller pieces until it makes like a sand. And then guess what? New little planular larva will come along from like coral egg and sperm and will land on these spaces and say, hey, this is a great place to grow. This is where I want to live. So that is like the cycle, a natural cycle of how coral reefs like form and reform over time. So coral reefs can also there's a few different types of coral reefs. So I want to show you this first island picture, and you can see this light sand color going around it of the coral reef. So there's an island here, and then you have this coral on the edge that's hanging off like a fringe, and this is called a fringing reef. It's attached to the land, and humans like come and visit it a lot. They go and swim in it. They think it looks so pretty. It's right off the land, and they fish in it, and they get a lot of benefit from that. Well, the coral reef, remember, it's a living thing. We don't think about it as a living thing, but because it's a living thing, it grows. But the dirt and land of the island, because it's not a living thing, sometimes it just starts to erode away. So as the land maybe erodes away, you have this even thicker coral reef that grows around it because it is growing while one is eroding away. This is called a barrier reef. Well, where now this little reef that was a fringing reef is now a barrier reef where it will protect this little island, and maybe you have to row out to it or take a boat out to it or swim out to the reef because it's a barrier reef. It's farther away from land now because the land has shrunk. Eventually, the land should erode away altogether, leaving a lagoon in the middle, and this is called an atoll. And they're so gorgeous. So let me show you those again. A fringing reef is usually around tropical or subtropical shores. They're connected to the shoreline, and they are the most affected by human activities because of how close they are to the land. And here's a bunch of reefs that are connected, fringing reefs directly next to the land. Fringing reef, like fringe on some kind of outfit. Okay, so there's also barrier reefs, and the most famous is obviously the Great Barrier Reef, which is in Australia, and that is a reef that is further from land. So usually there's a space in between, often called a lagoon, and then there's the mainland. Okay, and the Great Barrier Reef of Australia is actually so large you can see it from space, which is so cool. Okay, so then there's an atoll, and the atoll is the one where the reef is along the outside. The land has eroded. Sometimes it shows a little bit here, but mostly there's no land left. This is just a little patch reef and a lagoon. And usually it's forming in the cones of extinct volcanoes where the land has totally eroded away. Darwin actually had a theory of atoll formation, which is basically what we've already gone over. There is some kind of volcano, and the volcano went extinct, and eventually coral formed around it, making a fringing reef. The land kind of eroded, making a lagoon, until now there's just a lagoon and the reef around it. So these atolls are gorgeous. They maybe look terrifying to swim in, but you see this not deep at all reef ring around it, and then the deeper part where the land used to be but has now fallen through. So this is a video by the Khalid bin Sultan Living Oceans Foundation called The Birth of an Atoll, and I highly recommend you check that out. Okay, so the reef structure often has a reef front, it has a reef crest, and a reef flat. Obviously, this reef front part is really hit by waves, really hit by storms, hurricanes, everything else. This has to have some really strong corals that live here. The crest also has to be strong, but not as strong. And then this reef flat can have kind of more corals that can't handle as strong of a beating on this. In this reef crest area, you'll actually have some spur and groove formations, and I want to show you what that looks like from the side. So I see this really commonly in Hawaii, where you have areas where the corals will extend out really far, called the spur, and right next to it where it shoots inward, called the groove, and then another spur and a groove. And that kind of is in response to the wave action that's happening there. So if the waves kind of break really hard here and then wash back out there, it means that more coral can grow in these in-between spaces where the waves are not hitting as hard. So that is called a spur and groove formation. Okay, different coral populations. On the reef front, you can have a lot of these really big brain corals, not a shocker where it got its name. On intermediate slopes, like the one that I was swimming up, you saw a lot of the columnar pillar corals, which I was swimming up really deep and without a light, so it was hard to see those, but they are shaped like this. And then you can also see plate-like corals, and they're called plate corals, often called table corals. And you might ask what the difference is between a plate coral and a table coral. They're generally basically the same thing. A lot of times when I'm with other divers, you'll hear some of them say, oh, we saw plate corals, and they're usually referring to one that's about a couple feet or a foot or so big, about like a dinner plate. But if it's massive, then people tend to start just calling it a table coral just to tell you the size, but they're generally about the same. Higher up on the reef, where the wave energy is the greatest, is this awesome coral called the elkhorn coral. The crazy thing about this coral is in the Caribbean, they have a lot of this coral, and it actually is almost like parallel to the land underneath it. So if you look up images of this, it's really, really cool because you'll see it just like kind of mirror the land beneath it, and it can stop 99% of the wave energy that would otherwise crash into the Caribbean, causing erosion and massive like pulling away of the reef. It actually stops 99% of that wave energy because of its shape. It's highly important to that area to keep that alive. So other types of coral that are just so cool. Here's one called cluster and lace coral, very pretty. A star coral, which if you zoom in really close has tiny little polyps that are kind of star shaped. Here is the staghorn coral, and here's actually a video of them regrowing the staghorn coral for transplant other places. A rose coral, you can see how that's shaped like a rose, flower coral, and finger coral. This kind of looks like an index finger to me. So coral reef distribution, most are in shallower water, like 25 meters or less. My swim up, I started that swim up from 122 feet, which is more than 25 meters. But the coral did abruptly end there at about 122 feet. So it can go a little deeper than 25 meters, but not much. They need really warm waters, 25 or 23 to 25 degrees C. They need a lot of light. They need light because the zooxanthellae in them need to photosynthesize to give them energy. And because of that, so that the light can get through, the water can't be very cloudy, which we call turbid. You can't have turbid, dirty water. It's got to be crystal clear water to let that light through to the zooxanthellae. the salt has to be right. There has to be fresh water outflow. The wave action has to be right because, like hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones, they can all kill the coral. And if you have areas where the water has receded a lot, that air exposure will kill the coral. So you have to be really careful about that. Okay, in general, Pacific reefs are older than the Atlantic reefs, and the Atlantic reefs have some really good spur and groove reefs. And the Pacific reefs are very densely populated by coral, and there's a lot of algae in the Pacific corals. So I know this slide looks very similar here with the orange and the pink, but I want to say some differences between Atlantic and Pacific coral. So Atlantic coral can have like fire coral, gorgonians. They can have some of their corals tend to be more nocturnal and reproduce more often by fragmentation. Interesting, only about 1,750 species of mollusks and fish live in the Atlantic near the coral, okay? Whereas in the Indo-Pacific, there's about 7,200 species of mollusks and fish. So, I mean, it's almost like quadruple the amount of species in the Pacific as there is in the Atlantic of fish and mollusks, due to how the coral is different and also age over time. The water's also colder in the Atlantic, and so that makes it harder to survive. In the Pacific, there's more soft corals. The corals tend in the Pacific to be diurnal. They can be awake at night or the day, doesn't matter. And they tend to have more sexual reproduction. Okay, so the source of nutrients and how they're getting nutrients. Coral is exceptional at recycling nutrients, and most of the organisms on the reefs are. Atolls, in particular, really depend on water flowing by them. They also depend on cyanobacteria, which is a type of bacteria that can pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put it into a hardened form that the reef can actually use, which is really cool. A lot of reefs depend on a little bit of runoff from the land, of nutrients coming off the land to feed them, but you don't want too much. And then a lot of the nutrients are just stored in the biomass, that if you totally just pulled all the reef out, there would be no new nutrients for it to regrow. I highly recommend checking out this website from Mangala Station. This is a place that I got to visit when I was in Australia, where the Aboriginal people that live there actually bought back what had been made into a sugarcane field it was a wetland that had been made into a sugarcane field during like the 1800s. They bought it back within the last like 30 or so years, and I might have that story wrong, so go double check it on their website. But they have started to restore that sugarcane field to a wetland. And as part of that restoration, now instead of all the gross farming water coming down and polluting the reef there, the wetland actually filters all that water, and the reef, the ocean next to it, has totally been restored because they restored the wetland on the land, which is absolutely amazing and an important part done by the Aboriginal people there. So if you're looking for ecology and specifically like productivity, like how productive nutrients wise is a certain area, they have these different charts where you can read that and see how productive a certain organism is. Basically, if you have a number here in the productivity, if you have a number that's greater than 1, then that means at 1, if the number is exactly 1, that means that it's not under 1, meaning it's kind of dying off, and it's not over 1 where it's actually growing and you could actually take some away and harvest it because it's actually growing larger. At exactly one, it stays the same size every day, every year. That would be exact replacement value, okay? So with this chart, some of these organisms can be very unproductive, like zero point 0.1, that's way under one, that's not very productive. And sometimes you can have it like times four, where it's very rapidly growing. So basically, you want to look at these different organisms. If you want to see their productivity, you look at the range of how they can grow. And if they're producing more than, if scientists look at certain organisms and they measure them and they're producing more than one, then the reef or the specific species is kind of growing beyond what it was before, and it can either be harvested or just be left to grow, etc. So, in a certain space, when you go and see these corals, and this is a GIF that kind of shows the coral area being bleached, but if you're checking out a certain space, a certain area, the corals, and you're swimming over them, you might think these are really pretty corals. Look at all the pretty corals around. I really like them. What you don't maybe realize is there is a massive fight among these corals, different species, for space. Corals will literally grow over each other. They'll put out these like mesenterial type of filaments where they have stinging cells on their edge, where they're like, okay, don't, here's my edge, don't come near me. So I'm going to put out these stinging cells. So if you try to come here, I'll actually digest you. Some of them have longer sweeper tentacles with stinging cells on the end to like swing around to stop others growing. Some of them are like this coral here that is literally growing over this other coral, and you can see that in the picture, and it will overtake it and kill it over time. So what you don't see is that these are all animals that are competing for space, and just in one space you can have 70 to 80 species just in one tiny patch that are all competing for the space. So other competition is that a lot of stony corals that can't move and grow really slow, they tend to be overgrown and smothered. Algae a lot of times will grow on coral, and they grow more where it's shallow because algae really needs light. So they are a bigger threat to corals in the shallows than in the deep. Um, you can also see different urchins burrowing down in corals. I see this very regularly in Hawaii. Um, so this is an urchin called the diadema, and this was an example given where it will go and feed on algae that otherwise will kill the coral, except like a certain disease has recently killed 99% of them. So algae has now gotten out of control and is really hurting and killing a lot of the corals. Okay, there's a lot of competition among fish that live in these corals. And what's crazy is scientists have something called the competitive exclusion principle. And the competitive exclusion principle, it's just a principle. It's not like a theory or anything. But generally scientists say no two species can occupy the same niche at the same time. So pretty much like the organisms, they should all have their own space. But weird thing, it seems like the coral reefs completely defy this principle, where 60 to 70% of the fish are actually carnivores instead of herbivores, and only 15% are algae grazers or omnivores, meaning like the whole energy pyramid is completely reversed as far as the fish that live here. So scientists have tried to figure this out before, but it's highly debated and nobody knows for sure. Some hypotheses of why this happens is that there's a competition model, meaning that resources actually are partitioned out into a unique niche, but it's so nuanced that we don't really understand it. Some is that there's so much predation that keeps populations low. Some is that a lottery model is like when those planular larvae are just floating out there, the chances you find a rock are pretty small. And so maybe it's just by chance there's so many species. And the other one is the resource limitation model, which states that coral reefs basically don't have a carrying capacity that we know, like they can just support a huge number of organisms, unlike any other space on Earth. So, in coral reef communities, there are actually organisms that full time eat just coral, and I call them corallivores. So you can almost add them to the list of like an omnivore that eats lots of things, or a carnivore. You could maybe consider these carnivores because they're eating an animal, but since they're specifically just eating coral, a lot of times they are called corallivores. So here's a wrasse that will come up and take small bites off of the coral. Some of these organisms are actually going after the algae and not the coral polyps. But then here, it's like a parrotfish that they have these strong teeth, and you actually can see their bite marks of the coral, where there's like this big white bite mark off of the coral, and parrotfish swimming around. Interesting, as you see the parrotfish in the reef or these wrasse, they will actually poop out fecal matter that is just broken down rock white coral because they go and they take this bite and they digest off the algae and they digest off the polyps and the zooxanthellae, and then their excrement is just this white rock. It's just interesting that you see them pooping out this white sand from the coral. So predation, most of the predators on the coral are very polite, like these ones where they take their bite and then they move on. But very few corallivores actually will kill the entire coral because they care, and they evolutionarily have adapted that they don't want to kill the whole thing, with the exception of the crown of thorns sea star, which are horrific. I really don't like these guys. They have killed 1/3 of all species of Indo-Pacific coral since 1957. So in about 60, 70 years, they have killed 1/3 of the coral because of their populations. The problem with the crown of thorns sea star is that when there is a natural disaster like a hurricane, cyclone, typhoon, bleaching, something like that, it will kill the coral, but the crown of thorns populations actually increase exponentially during that time. So a bunch of scientists have actually started to work in groups to actually keep these populations under control and kill the stars. And here are different scientists doing that in the background. So anyways, next slide is the coral reef community. In the coral reef, there's other mutualistic relationships, and remember that's where both are positive. And one of the positive relationships is the cleaner wrasse, which will go and clean other fish. And these other fish, you can see, why doesn't this, like, I don't know if this is a puffer or a scorpion fish, but why doesn't it not just eat this wrasse? Well, it's not eating the wrasse because the wrasse is doing it a service. Or here, this grouper, it's getting its eyes cleaned, or this one, it's actually letting it crawl inside of its gills to eat off different little parasites. Those are cool, different symbiotic relationships that you see in the reef. Interesting, here in Southern California, we have a wrasse called a senorita, and it's just a very small fish like this that does that same job. And sometimes you'll actually see multiple fish waiting around a senorita, and a senorita has a little space, and they are waiting to be cleaned by the wrasse. So there's other symbiotic relationships there, like zooxanthellae. Zooxanthellae don't just live in the coral, they actually also live on things like the giant clam and do the same thing. They get a hidey place to live, a hidey hole, and the clam gets food from them. There's also different adaptations for hiding on the reef, like this fish hiding in the sand. I feel like this fish has been watching like Hunger Games or something. There's other fish that will expand their side. Parrotfish will actually make a whole mucus bubble, like a booger, that covers it every single night. And other fish, so while it sleeps, other predator fish like look at that and it's like, I'm not touching that, I'm not eating it, that's disgusting, and they go find something else. um, there's different adaptations for feeding on the reef. I highly recommend you check out this video called the National Geographic Wild Mantis Shrimp Packs a Punch. It is a shrimp that hits its prey so hard that it at the water surrounding its punch will temporarily turn the temperature of the sun. It actually gives off a slight amount of light and creates like air bubbles behind it. It's kind of crazy. Obviously, anything it hits dies. Here are Christmas tree worms that come out and they swing around these different stinging cells that sweep and kill what it wants to eat. And here is a crinoid. The first time I saw one of these swimming in the Great Barrier Reef, I thought I was going crazy. And it creates like a tent around its food and kind of uses like a sweeping action to move food into its mouth. Other adaptations of organisms with the coral is that some organisms will hide inside of soft coral. They'll use warning coloration. You have things that, hide like this. You have urchins that have hard tusks and spines or shells on mollusks or mucus on their skin, all meant to hide and conceal themselves on the reef. Okay, different things that can hurt um, the reef is having hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones. What are the difference? I put a map here by American Red Cross so you can see the differences in those. Basically, it's where you live on the planet. Wherever you live on the planet, we change the name just to be confusing. And the El Nino, when they hit, and La Ninas, those actually change ocean currents, temperatures, atmospheric pressures, wind conditions, so that some coral can be highly affected by this change. And then, of course, while they're trying to regrow, unfortunately, a lot of things try to eat the babies, because if you're a corallivore and then most of the coral has died, then you're going to just eat the little babies before they're even adults. And so it's really hard after one of these storms has happened for coral to regrow. Specifically, the El Nino of 1982 killed 50 to 98% of the coral in the East Pacific. So very devastating. Why are corals so important is the topic of this little video. It's from the World Economic Forum, and it's called Why We Should Care About Coral Reefs. They protect our coasts from wave action and high surf. They pull a ton of carbon dioxide and other pollutants out of the atmosphere. They make habitat for other fish, provide economic value, recreation value, and they also provide us with a lot of pharmaceutical products. One thing that's being looked at right now for corals is, why do corals not have a lot of mutations? Like humans get skin cancer from UV, but corals do not. And so they're being studied for like a skin cancer right now. So destructive things that humans do to negatively affect the reef are destructive fishing or developing right on the coast, or climate change has really hurt them. And I explained that earlier, and how coral bleaching happens. Different diseases that can occur on the reef are like the black band disease. You can see it here in this picture. They put the nail in one day and then took the picture the next day. It grows about a centimeter a day. So this is a disease that is growing outward. This white part is bleached and dead, and then is slowly eating. It's a bacteria and cyanobacteria that's eating the coral alive. White pox is very similar to that, but it is brought on by human and animal feces being left in the water, and that's disgusting. So other coral diseases is this white band disease, where chunks of the coral fall off. The skeleton falls off in chunks. White plague, and the Caribbean yellow band disease. There's actually this really cool video interview from Stinapa Bonaire. Why is stony coral tissue loss, or what is stony coral tissue loss? And I highly recommend you check that out. There are certain sunscreens and things that you can do to help the reef. If you go swimming in the ocean, these sunscreen chemicals will all kill the reef. Why? Because the reef depends on sunlight, and when some of your sunscreen comes off and goes into the water, which you have to reapply every so many minutes or hours because it has come off and gone into the reef. And when you do that, you're coating the coral and the other reef organisms with that sunblock, and it can no longer photosynthesize. Here is an infographic from Save the Reef. I constantly check this every year. These red ones are all examples of things with the toxic chemicals. And if you notice, a lot of these have words like Hawaiian or reef in the name, and you would think that they are safe, and they are not. These ones in the blue have all reef safe chemicals that do not hurt the photosynthesizing of the reef. Just to be fair to all companies, I have noticed a company from one year has like the bad chemicals. The next year, they have actually upgraded and gone to the good chemicals. So I highly recommend you give every product a new chance and you re-look at lists like that every year before you buy the sunblock. Or if you're a very pale person like me, that instead you just go buy a wetsuit. And then I'm not wearing any products. And when I go snorkeling or diving, I have a thin and a thick wetsuit that I trade out between. But basically, I don't have to worry about sunburning at all because I have the wetsuit on, and that wetsuit also makes it so that I can float. I don't have to swim as hard, and I also don't have to stand up and kick the heck out of the reef. Like I can just float above it, and it's really great. Here's a good video from Mexico where they're doing a restoration project, and here's a follow-up. Both of these are only a minute or two long. It's Sea Core Coral, a novel restoration project, and Sea Core Coral, it's working. Mass-reared elkhorn corals are thriving in the reef, so check out their good projects that they're doing. This is an infographic that really explains how the sunscreen is coating the coral and other sea animals and making them sick, and why you should not be using these certain sunscreens, and you should demand that companies do better and make reef safe products. From NOAA, here is the threats to coral reefs, an infographic about human effects on the coral reefs and lots of ways that you can help. Even if you live in the middle of the United States and you never go to the ocean, you can reduce how many fertilizers you use, pick up your pet waste, change out the way you get power to electric cars or drive less, compost your soil. There's all kinds of important things that you can do to make sure a reef is safe, even if you don't live directly next to it. Here's another NOAA infographic that shows the threats of overfishing to the coral reefs. And the last infographic that I would encourage you to look at is this one from NOAA on climate change, that has all the different ways that coral is affected by climate change and also things that you can do to help. So that concludes our video on coral reefs. I do hope that you get to go visit one, and I hope you pick products and encourage companies that help protect the reef.